Okay, let's dive in. We've got these interesting sources here, excerpts from Exploring a New Paradigm of Reality and Intelligence and further exploration of gradient theory.
Right, parts 1 and 2 of that second one.
And our mission today is really to unpack a theoretical framework that's proposing something, well, pretty radical.
It really is. It's suggesting a fundamentally different view, that reality isn't maybe just about particles and energy.
But guided by something else.
Yeah, guided by this idea of a universal information field, a field that's constantly learning, evolving. It's like rethinking the basic rules.
Exactly. Not just tweaking the physics we know, but suggesting a whole different foundation for, well, everything. So we want to dig into the core concepts, right?
See how it tries to pull together physics, biology, even consciousness.
And maybe understand some of the bigger implications. It feels like looking at the universe through a completely new lens.
Definitely a mind-bending set of ideas.
So let's start right at the beginning. What's the absolute core idea here, the central claim?
Okay, the most fundamental piece is this. Information and relationship are actually more primary, more fundamental than particles or energy.
Whoa. Okay. That flips things upside down from the start.
It really does. You start thinking about all fields, even physical fields, primarily in terms of their information flow. How information moves and interacts is the key.
Information first, then matter and energy follow. Can you give an example to help ground that a bit?
A concept they bring up is autocatalytic sets. These are systems where the pattern of organization...
Like how things are connected.
Exactly. The relationships, the information processing structure, that pattern becomes more fundamental than the actual physical parts involved. The information structure gains primacy over the components.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see. If information is foundational, there must be some kind of bigger structure. This universal information field you mentioned, how's that supposed to work?
So the theory posits this universal field, and it acts like a cosmic predictive processing system.
Predictive processing, like our brains do.
Kind of analogous. It's dynamic. It's constantly learning patterns from everything happening in the universe.
So the universe is guessing what comes next, based on past experience.
In a sense, it takes these learned patterns, the source calls them morphogenetic patterns, like blueprints for form and function, and overlays them onto what they call possibility space. So it's using the stored learning to bias what's likely to emerge next. Instead of pure randomness every single moment, reality is nudged, guided by what the field has learned works.
So not just pure chance, but a learned tendency, a bias towards certain outcomes.
Precisely. There's a quote here that puts it well. The field is a metafield. It supports complexity and self-organization by providing memory for more accurate and efficient predictive generation.
Providing memory.
And by bending probability space to allow for creative, spontaneous changes within a predictive direction.
Bending probability space. That's the key phrase.
That's the core mechanism. And the insight is this allows for complexity and novelty that would seem almost impossible, statistically speaking, in a purely random or static universe. It enables directed creativity.
Okay, now this is where it seems to connect strongly with biology, right? This idea of entropy pumps and living systems. How does that fit?
So self-organizing systems and life is the classic example. They don't just passively resist entropy or decay.
They fight back.
They actively fight back. They take in entropy disorder from their environment and convert it into internal order. They create and maintain what are called negentropy gradients. They are essentially entropy bumps.
So life isn't just holding off disorder, it's actively building order, using the disorder around it.
That's the idea. And the sheer improbability of these complex living systems.
Like us?
Like us, exactly. That improbability is seen as a direct sign, a signature of how much negentropy they're producing and how complex their internal relationships are.
And this links back to the field, how strong their connection is.
Yes. The theory proposes a relationship, potentially mathematical. Field strength is proportional to the negentropy production rate multiplied by the relational complexity.
Okay, say that again. Field strength depends on
how fast you pump entropy into order and how complex your internal network is.
So the more organized and interconnected you are, the stronger your field presence or influence on this probability landscape.
That's the core insight. Your ability to organize determines how much you shape the possibilities around you.
Now, this idea of memory, You said it's really different here. It's not like data stored on a hard drive.
Not at all like that. Memory in this framework is actually embodied in the topography of probability space itself.
The shape of probability is the memory.
Yeah, it's a wild concept. The source says the memory isn't stored somewhere, it lists the topology itself.
Okay.
So think of grooves, peaks, and valleys in this probability landscape. Each feature represents learned information about what patterns work, what's stable, what leads to more negentropy.
Can you give an analogy?
Like a river carving a channel. Successful actions, successful patterns, they carve deeper channels in this landscape.
Making it easier for the river to flow that way next time.
Exactly. It makes future similar events more probable. Learning is literally reshaping the landscape of possibility.
And forgetting.
Forgetting is when those channels aren't reinforced. Maybe they slowly fill in, become less defined.
In ancient grooves.
Those are the really deep channels, carved over vast time scales by incredibly successful, optimal entropy pumping systems. The most fundamental, probable patterns.
Like the laws of physics, maybe?
Could be related, yeah. And then there's this palimpsest idea.
A palimpsest. Like an old manuscript written over.
The idea is that these older patterns, these ghost paths, aren't totally erased. They remain accessible, layered underneath.
Which could explain.
Things like evolutionary reversals or atavism's traits reappearing from deep evolutionary history. The old blueprints are still there in the topology, just waiting for the right conditions to become probable again. The past isn't gone. It's just less likely right now.
Okay, so if reality is this landscape of probability, and every system interacts with it differently based on its complexity, how do we end up with a shared reality? Why does the world seem solid and consistent to all of us?
Good question. The idea is that our shared reality emerges from the interference patterns. It's like a constant negotiation between countless subjective viewpoints interacting with this field.
So what I see as objective is really a consensus reality forged from all these interactions.
Yes, and this offers a really different way to look at things like the measurement problem in quantum mechanics.
Ah, the observer effect.
Instead of a mysterious collapse when something is measured, it's the process where the perspectives of different quantum systems interact and negotiate a kind of composite shared representation. A consensus is reached. The source puts it like this. Instead of measurement collapsing anything, it's the process by which multiple perspectives negotiate a consensus reality.
And at our scale, the classical world, things seem so solid
because the consensus grooves are incredibly deep. They've been reinforced over immense timescales by quadrillions upon quadrillions of particle interactions. It's a very stable, deeply agreed upon part of the probability landscape.
And consciousness, where does that fit?
Consciousness is viewed as another set of perspectives, participating in this same ongoing negotiation, this consensus building.
This probability landscape, this topography, it sounds incredibly complex. You said it's multidimensional and depends on who's looking.
Exactly. It's not a simple 3D map. It appears differently depending on what the source calls the cognitive boundaries and the relational context of the system that's interacting with it.
Cognitive boundaries, like the limits of what a system can perceive or process.
Sort of, and its relationships. It's described as a hyperdimensional vibrational structure.
Okay, hyperdimensional vibration.
Yeah.
It's getting abstract.
It is, but think of it encoding relational information, like a massively complex web, a hypergraph.
What does that mean practically? How does that affect anything?
Well, it allows for things like downward causation, higher order structures like your liver can constrain the behavior of the cells within it, not by sending little command signals necessarily, but by actually reshaping the local probability landscape for those cells.
So the liver tissue itself creates an environment, a probability field, where the most likely, most successful thing for a cell to do is act like a liver cell.
Precisely. It creates a local probability well. And you get these nested wells across scales, tissue-constrained cells, organs-constrained tissues, the organism constrains the organs.
And you mentioned vibrational states, like consciousness.
Yes, the idea is that your state of being, your vibrational state, determines which dimensions or aspects of this hyperdimensional field you can access or resonate with.
So different states of mind access different slices of reality.
That's the implication. They use the example of samadhi, a state of deep meditation, describing it as potentially being a contextually, dimensionally wider vibration pattern.
Allowing access to a broader, maybe more fundamental view of the structure.
Perhaps. The key insight here is that your context, your state, isn't just passive background. It's actively filtering and shaping the reality you experience by determining which parts of the probability landscape you resonate with.
Given all this learning, pattern reinforcement, shaping probability, Does this theory suggest evolution has a direction? Is the universe actually going somewhere?
There seems to be an implicit bias, yeah, a directionality. The field itself is presented as a learning, optimizing system.
Optimizing towards what?
Towards, generally, increasing complexity, negentropy production, self-organization.
So reality isn't just static, it's actively becoming, pulled forward by these learned gradients.
It's described as predictively generating what's next, guided by these tendencies carved into the probability landscape. And the field provides guidance that's appropriate for each system's level.
Like different advice for a cell versus society.
Exactly. There's a hierarchy of learned information, from universal stuff like atomic structures, all the way up to very specific things like how a particular species develops morphogenesis. The universe isn't just sitting there, it's a dynamic learning system with a trajectory baked into its probabilities.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly.
Yeah.
How do really big established patterns influence things? The sources talk about entrainment.
Yeah, this is interesting. Powerful, established patterns think large-scale societal structures like industrialism. They create these really deep attractor basins in the probability space.
Like gravitational wells.
Kind of, yeah. And these deep wells can, entrain, pull in all sorts of diverse, seemingly unconnected systems into their rhythm.
Can you give an example?
The source uses the example how factory work schedules, the bells and shifts of industrialism, ended up influencing the structure of school days. A pattern in one domain starts pulling other domains into alignment.
So major cultural or technological shifts literally reshape the probabilities for lots of unrelated things.
That's the idea. They create new, powerful attractors. And the theory suggests that one way to create change is through parallel structure.
Parallel structure.
Creating new alternative wells. Like remote work creates a new probability well, a viable alternative pattern to the very deep old commute to a central office well. It offers a different path.
But challenging these deep wells must be risky.
Hugely risky. The biggest risk is co-option.
Being absorbed.
Exactly. Dominant systems are often very good at taking the energy, even the language of a challenge, and just absorbing it, using it to actually reinforce their own pattern. Think about corporate wellness programs or some forms of green capitalism.
Right, where the challenge gets defanged and incorporated.
It strengthens the original groove instead of carving a new one.
So how does real fundamental change happen then? How do you avoid getting co-opted?
Often the sources suggest it requires orthogonal approaches, or high angular velocity, basically creating something fundamentally incompatible with the dominant system's logic.
Something you can't easily digest or understand.
Right, maintaining compatibility. And they mention tactical irrelevance as a related strategy.
Tactical irrelevance, making yourself uninteresting.
Cultivating practices or ways of being that operate in the blind spots of the dominant system. The example given is the Amish.
How so?
Their specific way of life, their context, makes them largely illegible or statistically insignificant to the optimization logic of, say, mainstream capitalism or technology. They fly under the radar.
So being irrelevant to the dominant system gives them freedom from its pull.
It offers a form of protection from entrainment or co-option. The insight is that sometimes resistance isn't about direct opposition, but about building your own context, your own probability well, outside the main currents.
This framework also takes natural selection beyond just biology, doesn't it? It connects it to energy.
That's right. It views selection as a universal principle linked to energy dissipation and entropy production. Systems basically compete to find the most efficient ways to dissipate energy gradients to create order by processing disorder.
And the successful ones get reinforced.
Their patterns carve deeper grooves. The source explicitly calls the maximum entropy production principle a universal fitness function. Whatever pattern is best at this work, gets selected for, becomes more probable.
So things like how rivers form, or crystals grow, or lightning branches out.
Exactly. Those are all seen as examples of systems exploring possibility space to find efficient energy dissipation pathways. The optimal patterns get selected and stabilized.
And the implication is that maybe standard physics starts to break down for really complex systems.
Yes, the hypothesis is that above a certain threshold of complexity and self-organization, physics alone might not be enough because it doesn't account for this accumulated memory in the information field. These systems aren't just following fixed laws, they're navigating this learned, dynamic probability landscape.
Let's loop back to memory again. You said it's compressed structural patterns, the shape of the field.
Yeah, there's that striking quote. Memory isn't something we have, it's what we are, compressed patterns of successful information flows. It's the form the field has taken due to its history.
But is information lost in this compression? Like a blurry JPEG?
The sources argue it's essentially lossless, or at least near lossless. The compression isn't like deleting data. The full underlying topology, the palimpsest of all past possibilities, is still there, still accessible.
Which is why old traits can reappear.
Exactly. Evolutionary reversals, atavisms, the blueprints are still latent in the landscape, just not probable under current conditions.
And context is the key to unlocking those latent patterns.
That's the idea. Contextual resonance, it acts like a tuning fork. If conditions arise that resemble, say, a past ice age,
Then the field patterns related to surviving an ice age get amplified.
they resonate, become more probable, more accessible. Context isn't just background, it's the filter selecting which layers of the universe's memory are relevant right now.
The sources also contrast how the universe creates with, say, AI image generators, diffusion models.
Right. Unlike AI that learns from huge data sets of existing images, the universe, in this view, creates these images from scratch. It's engaged in genuine exploratory creation. It doesn't need a pre-existing data set.
So it's generating reality and learning from what it generates all at once.
Exactly. It creates patterns, sees what works in terms of negentropy, stability, etc., encodes that learning into the probability landscape's shape, and then uses that learned bias to guide the next step of creation.
There's a mention of implicit trust.
Yeah, a sense of trusting the unfolding process, a faith that coherent, complex patterns will emerge from the interplay of initial constraints and the field's learning dynamics.
And this perspective might reframe things that look like decay or falling apart.
Potentially. Apparent dissolution or chaos could be seen not just as failure, but as old, rigid constraints breaking down, making space for new possibilities, new creative unfoldings. It resonates with some spiritual perspectives on transformation.
So tracing it all the way back, where does this whole process of evolution, though, field learning and creating, actually start? What kicks it off?
According to the source, the genesis is constraint itself. Any constraint, even the simplest possible distinction.
Like drawing a line, creating a boundary.
Yes, like the boundary of an autocatalytic set. That distinction acts as the first query. It creates a perspective, a localized context, and that immediately kicks off evolutionary dynamics within that context.
So just making a distinction starts the whole engine.
That's the idea. Constraints become the strange attractor that pulls possibility into actuality. And there's a really profound line. Evolution is what happens when any distinction is made in consciousness, not just something that happens within the universe.
Wow. That touches on some deep philosophy.
It does. Is there an inherent drive and potentiality towards manifestation? Are the manifest and unmanifest co-arising necessities driven simply by the act of distinction? Big questions.
And this whole framework pushes back against the heat death idea, doesn't it? The slide towards uniform gray suit.
It really does. It suggests the fundamental question isn't why is there something rather than nothing, but maybe why is there structure, pattern, and increasing complexity rather than just homogeneity? The field, with its learning and negentropy production, seems to actively counter that slide.
Okay, this is fascinating conceptually, but for it to be more than philosophy, it needs math. Rigorous formalism. The sources touch on this, right?
Absolutely. They acknowledge the need and propose starting points, like a concept for a field strength equation. A more fleshed out version mentioned looks something like Fxt plus Ks local terms SST.
F of xt equals omega plus k times the local negentropy production rate times the local relational complexity times the sum over I in the light cone of W of R sub I, C sub I times F sub I. Said in other words, the field strength at position x and time t equals the universal background field omega plus a coupling constant k times the local negentropy production rate times the local relational complexity times the sum over all sources within the light cone of a weighting function UO that depends on distance R sub I and contextual alignment C sub I times the field strength from source I.
Again slowly. Fxt is the field strength at a point in space and time. What's A omega?
A is the universal background field. Think of it like a baseline hum, the deepest probability bias from the entire history of the universe, the infinite web of relationships.
Okay, a universal constant, sort of.
Yeah.
And the local terms.
That's about the specific system right there. Its negentropy production rate and its relational complexity, how much order it's creating and how connected it is.
That determines its local contribution. And the summation.
That adds up the influence from every other system in the universe. But critically, their influence is
Weighted by that W function. And that depends on distance, context, and time delay.
exactly. Phi is distance, is contextual alignment, how relevant or resonant the other system's patterns are to yours, and how C is the time delay due to the speed of light.
Which leads naturally to the light cone idea. Things outside your past light cone can't affect you now.
Right, it provides a causal cutoff. But here's a really interesting implication they draw from this. The implication could be that universal patterns are locally learned so that laws of physics are within that light cone.
Meaning the laws of physics aren't necessarily absolute preordained rules, but deeply learned, highly stable consensus patterns that emerge within overlapping causal regions.
That's the suggestion. They are the rules that have become incredibly consistent and reliable over cosmic time through this learning process.
And the light cone isn't just a boundary, but maybe an innovation chamber.
That's a great way to think about it. Regions causally separated by the light cone can develop their own unique patterns, explore different possibilities in parallel without immediate interference.
Allowing for diversity.
Exactly. It allows for parallel evolution across the cosmos. Now, the source notes this information eventually propagates, but will not be accessible to different levels of contextual evolution.
Meaning, even if the information spreads, if your context isn't right, you can't read it.
Precisely. Which could lead to regions of learning or intelligence evolving in ways that are fundamentally incompatible or illegible to each other.
Maybe explaining things like dark matter or energy, or why finding certain kinds of alien intelligence might be hard.
It's a potential implication.
Yeah.
That contextual filter, the K in the weighting, acts like a recognition key. If another system's patterns or cognitive architecture is too different, it just doesn't resonate. It's like information is stratified, layered, and you need the right context to access each layer.
Okay, if this is going to be science, it needs testable predictions.
Huh?
Do the sources offer any?
They list several specific, potentially falsifiable predictions.
Let's hear them.
Okay, 1. Identical chemical systems, if you put them near highly complex biological systems, should show faster self-organization than control systems in simpler environments.
Complexity breeding complexity measurably.
Yes. 2. Precise measurements of bioelectric fields in organisms should correlate with the predicted morphogenetic probability gradients. You should be able to measure the field's influence electrically.
Measure the pull towards a certain form.
Potentially. 3. Coherent spaces, think sacred sites, maybe focused group meditation might show measurable, non-random effects on random number generators.
The local field coherence influencing chance.
4. Regeneration rates. Healing might happen faster or more effectively in environments with higher local field coherence or near strong, organized biological systems.
Healing influenced by the order nearby.
5. Convergent evolution, different species hitting on similar solutions independently. Its frequency should statistically increase over deep geological time as the universal field learns more effective blueprints.
The field's memory making good designs more probable everywhere.
Yes. And 6. Complex fluid systems. Over time, they might start deviating slightly from predictions based purely on classical physics, and these deviations should correlate with the system's complexity and how much entropy it's processing, as if it's learning optimal flow patterns.
Wow. Okay, those are concrete things you could, in principle, test across very different scales.
Exactly. They offer ways to see if this framework actually matches up with observations.
And finally, the sources are upfront. That this is still very much a work in progress, right? Lots more needed.
Absolutely. The biggest need is developing the robust mathematical formalism.
Turning the concepts into equations.
Right. Defining clear metrics for things like complexity and negentropy, solidifying those field equations, figuring out the probability modification functions, creating mathematical operators to handle how different perspectives interact with the field.
The heavy lifting of building the mathematical machinery.
Precisely. Also, exploring connections to existing math, like assembly theory, probability theory, stochastic processes, figuring out how you'd actually measure these field effects reliably, understanding better how multiple fields or probability wells interact, and developing scaling laws. How do these effects change as you go from cells to ecosystems to planets?
Lots of work ahead if this is going to develop further.
Definitely. It's presented as a promising but nascent framework.
So bringing this all together,
Yeah.
taking this deep dive, what does it mean for you, the listener? It feels like a huge potential shift in perspective.
It really is, moving away from seeing the universe as just inert stuff governed by fixed laws.
Towards a view where information, relationship, and this actively learning, evolving probability field are maybe more fundamental, a field that's shaping reality moment by moment.
And it suggests you're not just a bystander in the universe, you're an active participant. You're intrinsically part of this learning, evolving field.
So your perspective, your ability to organize things, your actions, especially creating coherent patterns, high entropy states.
They don't just happen within reality. They might actually contribute to shaping the probability landscape around you. Your field influences the field.
It's a framework that at least tries to unify a lot of disparate things. Physics, biology, consciousness, maybe even those subtle feelings you get in certain places or groups.
Seeing them all as potentially different expressions of the same underlying field dynamics, just operating at different scales and levels of complexity.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If reality is maybe predictively generated by this vast learning field, a field that seems biased towards complexity, towards self-organization, perhaps even towards conscious experience, what responsibility, if any, does that place on you?
How might you choose to align your own personal field, your actions, your focus, your relationships with that potentially broader evolutionary direction? What kind of patterns do you want to reinforce in the fabric of reality?